Officer Aidan Scott shifted in the witness chair, eyeing the defendant across the courtroom with undisguised contempt. When the defense attorney asked about his client's military service, Scott let out a short laugh. "Purple Heart," he scoffed into the microphone, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom. "Half these guys buy those medals at pawn shops. Real heroes don't end up in my squad car." The elderly black man in the defendant's chair didn't flinch, but something flickered behind his eyes. Not anger, but the kind of patience that comes from surviving things most people couldn't imagine. What Officer Scott didn't know was that the man sitting 15 feet away had earned that Purple Heart 37 years ago in a place where bullets were real and brotherhood meant more than a badge. "Which state are you from? Have you ever witnessed someone's service being disrespected by the very people sworn to protect them? When authority becomes a weapon against those who earn the right to be respected, who speaks for honor?" The morning had started like any other in the Riverside County Superior Court. Judge Catherine Martinez presided over what appeared to be a routine case, a homeless veteran charged with petty theft from a convenience store. The prosecution's star witness was Officer Aidan Scott, a 15-year veteran of the force with a reputation for aggressive policing and zero tolerance for what he called society's freeloaders. Kevin Ramsey sat quietly in his defendant's chair, wearing the only suit he owned, a brown jacket that had seen better days, but was clean and pressed. At 68, his hair was silver gray, his hands weathered from decades of hard work, and his posture carried the unmistakable bearing of a man who had once stood at attention while bullets flew overhead. The Purple Heart medal sat in evidence, bag 47B, on the prosecutor's table, a piece of metal and ribbon that told a story Scott had never bothered to learn. The courtroom was half empty, typical for a Tuesday morning arraignment. A few family members of other defendants, a court reporter, and 2 journalists covering routine cases. Nobody expected what was about to unfold. In the gallery, Kevin's niece Sarah clutched her purse, praying that someone would finally listen to her uncle's truth. She had tried to contact the public defender about Kevin's military record, but the overworked attorney had barely glanced at the papers she brought. Defense attorney Mark Torres was young, idealistic, and drowning in a caseload that would break most lawyers. He had 15 minutes to prepare for Kevin's case between hearings, and the facts seemed straightforward. Elderly man caught on security camera taking a sandwich and water bottle from a Quick Mart, claiming he was hungry and homeless. The owner wanted to press charges as an example, open and shut. But something about Kevin's demeanor had caught Torres's attention during their brief meeting. The man didn't act like the typical defendants he represented. There was a dignity about him, a way of speaking that suggested education and experience. When Torres asked about his background, Kevin had mentioned military service, but there hadn't been time to dig deeper. Officer Scott adjusted his uniform jacket and cleared his throat. The prosecution had called him to establish the arrest and Kevin's prior encounters with law enforcement. Scott relished these moments, being the authoritative voice of law and order, putting criminals in their place. He had arrested Kevin twice before for loitering and once for public intoxication, though that charge had been dropped when Kevin proved he was stone-cold sober. "Officer Scott," the prosecutor began, "can you describe your interactions with the defendant, Mr. Ramsey?" Scott leaned into the microphone with the confidence of a man who had testified hundreds of times. "Kevin Ramsey is what we call a frequent flyer, Your Honor. Homeless individual, multiple arrests for vagrancy, public nuisance, petty theft. Classic case of someone who refuses to take responsibility for his life choices." In the defendant's chair, Kevin's jaw tightened slightly, but he remained silent. His lawyer had instructed him to stay quiet, let the system play out. Kevin had learned long ago that fighting only made things worse, especially for someone like him. "He carries around this military stuff," Scott continued, warming to his subject. "Claims he's a veteran, shows people this Purple Heart medal like it means something. But Your Honor, I've been on the force 15 years, and I've seen every scam in the book. These guys, they collect military memorabilia, buy stuff at flea markets and pawn shops. They think waving around some medal will get them sympathy, special treatment." The courtroom fell quiet. Even the court reporter looked up from her machine. Judge Martinez frowned slightly. She had 2 sons serving overseas and took military service seriously. Defense attorney Torres felt his stomach drop. He hadn't realized Kevin claimed to be a veteran, much less a decorated one. If Scott was right, this case just became much more complicated. But something in Kevin's posture, the way he held himself despite the humiliation, made Torres hesitate. "Officer Scott," Torres said, rising to his feet, "did you ever verify Mr. Ramsey's military service?" Scott's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Verify what? You can buy a Purple Heart on eBay for $50. I've seen guys with closets full of medals they never earned. It's called stolen valor, and it's disgusting." Kevin's hands, resting on the defendant's table, trembled slightly, not from fear or shame, but from the effort it took to remain silent. 37 years since Vietnam, and he could still hear the helicopter rotors, still smell the jungle smoke, still feel the weight of pulling his wounded squad leader from the wreckage while enemy fire peppered the ground around them. "These people," Scott continued, his voice growing more animated, "they think a costume and some trinkets make them heroes, real soldiers, real veterans. They don't end up living in cardboard boxes and stealing from convenience stores. They have honor, discipline, pride in themselves." Sarah Ramsey's eyes filled with tears in the gallery. She wanted to stand up, to scream the truth about her uncle's service, about the 3 Bronze Stars and Distinguished Service Cross that he kept in a safety deposit box because he couldn't bear to look at them most days, about the nightmares that still woke him, about the survivor's guilt that had driven him to drink for 20 years before he finally got sober. But Kevin caught her eye and shook his head slightly. Not yet. He had learned patience in the jungles of Southeast Asia, learned that sometimes you wait for the right moment to act. This wasn't that moment. Judge Martinez was growing uncomfortable with Scott's testimony. While she agreed that stolen valor was serious, something about the officer's tone bothered her. There was a personal animosity there, a level of contempt that seemed excessive for a routine theft case. "Officer Scott," she interjected, "do you have specific evidence that Mr. Ramsey's military service is fraudulent?" Scott straightened in his chair. "Your Honor, I don't need specific evidence when common sense tells you everything you need to know. Look at him. Does that look like a war hero to you? Real veterans don't fall through the cracks like this. They have support systems, VA benefits, fellow soldiers who look out for them." What Scott didn't know, what none of them knew yet, was that Kevin Ramsey had fallen through those very cracks that were supposed to catch him, that his PTSD had gone undiagnosed for decades, that the VA paperwork for his benefits had been lost in a fire at a regional office in that his pride had prevented him from fighting the bureaucracy, and his trauma had made it impossible to navigate the system designed to help him. Kevin remembered the day he earned that Purple Heart with perfect clarity. April 15, 1987. Helicopter crash in hostile territory. 3 men dead, 5 wounded, and Kevin making the choice to go back into the burning wreckage, not once, but twice, pulling out soldiers who would have died if he hadn't acted. The shrapnel that tore through his shoulder and collapsed his lung had hurt less than listening to Officer Scott mock that sacrifice. Torres shuffled through his papers, wishing he had more time to prepare. The prosecution seemed to have a solid case. Kevin was caught on camera, didn't deny taking the items, and apparently had a history of arrests. But something about Scott's testimony felt wrong, like there was more to this story. "Officer Scott," Torres said, "in your 15 years of service, how many actual cases of stolen valor have you personally investigated?" Scott hesitated for just a moment. "I don't need to investigate what's obvious." "That's not what I asked. How many cases have you personally investigated where someone was fraudulently claiming military honors?" "Objection," the prosecutor said. "Relevance?" Judge Martinez considered. "I'll allow it. Answer the question, Officer Scott." Scott's confidence wavered slightly. "Well, there haven't been formal investigations per se, but when you work the streets, you develop an instinct for these things." Kevin closed his eyes briefly, remembering the weight of his squad leader's body as he dragged him from the helicopter. Sergeant Williams had lived, gone on to marry his high school sweetheart, raise 3 kids, and die peacefully in his sleep 15 years later. At the funeral, Williams's widow had hugged Kevin and whispered, "He never forgot what you did. He said you saved his life." The irony wasn't lost on Kevin. He had saved lives in Vietnam, And now he was being accused of stealing the honor that came from that service. The system he had served was failing him in ways he never could have imagined as a 19-year-old soldier boarding a transport plane to Southeast Asia. Defense attorney Torres was running out of questions and time. He could see that Judge Martinez was ready to move forward with sentencing. Kevin had essentially admitted guilt to the theft. He took the sandwich and water because he was hungry and thirsty. The question was whether his claimed military service would generate any sympathy from the court. "Your Honor," Torres said, "I'd like to request a brief recess to consult with my client about his military service records." Scott couldn't resist one final jab. "Your Honor, we could be here all day chasing down fake paperwork. I've dealt with Mr. Ramsey multiple times. He's got mental health issues, probably substance abuse problems, and he uses this military fantasy to avoid taking responsibility for his choices. Real veterans deserve better than having their service mocked by pretenders." The words hit Kevin like physical blows. Mental health issues, true, but earned in service to his country. Substance abuse, 20 years sober, but the pain that drove him to drink had been real. Military fantasy, the opposite of truth, but how could he prove it sitting in a defendant's chair while a uniformed officer dismissed his sacrifice? Kevin's niece Sarah couldn't stay silent any longer. She stood up in the gallery, her voice carrying across the courtroom. "Your Honor, my uncle served 3 tours in Vietnam. He has the documentation." "Ma'am, please sit down," Judge Martinez said firmly. "You'll have a chance to speak during the sentencing phase if needed." Scott turned in his chair to look at Sarah, his expression skeptical. "They all have family members who will back up their stories, Your Honor. It's part of the con." That was the moment Kevin Ramsey's patience finally reached its limit, not because of the insults to him personally, but because Scott had just dismissed his niece's honesty, had just called his family liars. Kevin had endured everything else in silence, but attacking his family crossed a line that even his military discipline couldn't hold. Kevin stood slowly, his movement causing both the bailiff and Officer Scott to tense. But there was nothing threatening about his posture, just the bearing of a man who had finally decided it was time to speak his truth. "Your Honor," Kevin said, his voice steady and clear, carrying the authority of someone who had once given orders under fire, "I would like permission to address the court." Judge Martinez studied his face for a long moment. Despite everything she had heard, there was something about Kevin Ramsey that commanded respect. "You may speak, Mr. Ramsey." Kevin looked directly at Officer Scott, who stared back with amused contempt. The courtroom fell silent, waiting for what would come next. In that moment, the weight of 37 years of carrying invisible wounds, of being failed by systems that were supposed to help him, of watching his service mocked by someone who had never heard a shot fired in anger, all of it crystallized into a quiet dignity that would change everything. "Officer Scott," Kevin said, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom, "you're right about one thing. Real veterans do deserve better. They deserve better than being called liars by people who don't understand what service means." The battle lines were drawn. On one side, a police officer who had never questioned his assumptions about homeless veterans. On the other, a man whose Purple Heart had been earned in blood and whose truth was about to surface in ways that would shock everyone in that courtroom. What happened next would expose not just Officer Aiden Scott's ignorance, but an entire system's failure to honor the men and women who had served their country with distinction, only to be abandoned when they needed help the most. The real trial was just beginning. Kevin Ramsey was 19 years old when he first heard the helicopter rotors that would haunt his dreams for the next 49 years. It was March 1969, and he was 6 months into his first tour in Vietnam, stationed at Firebase Charlie near the Cambodian border. The morning mist hung heavy over the jungle canopy, and intelligence reports suggested enemy movement in the valley below their position. The young soldier from Detroit had volunteered for the Army 2 days after his high school graduation. Not because he believed in the war, not because he sought glory, but because his father had served in Korea and taught him that sometimes a man's duty was bigger than his own desires. Kevin's mother had cried for 3 days straight when he enlisted, but she also helped him pack his bags with the pride that comes from raising a son who understood responsibility. Basic training at Fort Benning had been tough, but manageable. Kevin was naturally athletic, intelligent, and possessed an unusual ability to stay calm under pressure. His drill sergeants noticed his leadership potential early, and by the time he shipped out to Southeast Asia, he wore corporal stripes and carried the respect of men who had seen everything the military could throw at them. Vietnam was different from anything the training manuals had described. The humidity hit you like a wall the moment you stepped off the transport plane. The jungle seemed alive with threats, not just the enemy, but the land itself. Snakes, insects, diseases that could kill you as efficiently as any bullet. But Kevin adapted quickly, earning the trust of his squad and the attention of his commanding officers. By April 1987, Kevin was a sergeant and had already earned 2 Bronze Stars for actions under fire. His 3rd tour was supposed to be his last. He had plans to return to Detroit, use his GI Bill to study engineering, maybe start a family. The war was winding down, and there was talk that American forces would be pulling out soon. Kevin just had to survive 6 more months. The mission that changed everything was supposed to be routine. Intelligence had reported a downed pilot 3 clicks into hostile territory, and Kevin's squad was part of the rescue operation. They loaded into 2 Huey helicopters just after dawn, flying low through the valleys to avoid enemy radar. Kevin remembered looking down at the jungle canopy and thinking how beautiful it looked from above, green and peaceful, hiding the violence that waited below. The first helicopter, carrying 6 soldiers including Kevin, took heavy fire as they approached the landing zone. Small arms at first, then something bigger, probably a rocket-propelled grenade that caught the tail rotor and sent them spinning toward the trees. Kevin would later learn that the downed pilot they were trying to rescue had been dead for 2 days, and the entire mission was a trap designed to bring down American aircraft. The crash happened in slow motion and lightning speed simultaneously. Kevin remembered the pilot shouting warnings, the sick feeling in his stomach as the helicopter lost control, the sound of metal tearing through branches, and the impact that threw him against the bulkhead, hard enough to crack 2 ribs. Then silence, broken only by the hiss of steam from the damaged engine and the distant sound of enemy voices moving through the jungle toward their position. Kevin regained consciousness to find himself hanging upside down in his safety harness, blood dripping from a gash on his forehead into his eyes. The helicopter had landed nose first against a massive tree, its back end tilted skyward at a 45-degree angle. Around him he could hear moaning from the other soldiers, some conscious, some not, at least one ominously silent. The smell of aviation fuel was overwhelming, and Kevin could see flames beginning to lick at the engine compartment. His first instinct was to free himself and get out, but his training and his character wouldn't let him abandon his squad. Despite the pain in his ribs and the disorientation from the head wound, Kevin began working to free the other soldiers. Private Martinez was unconscious but breathing, hanging in his harness with blood streaming from his nose. Kevin managed to cut him free and drag him clear of the wreckage just as the engine compartment erupted in flames. The heat was intense, and Kevin could hear ammunition beginning to cook off inside the burning helicopter. Staff Sergeant Williams, Kevin's squad leader and a man he respected more than his own father, was trapped beneath a piece of twisted metal, conscious but unable to move. His legs were pinned, and Kevin could see bone protruding from his left thigh. Williams was trying to wave Kevin away, telling him to save himself, but Kevin wasn't listening. Working with an entrenching tool and his bare hands, Kevin managed to lever the metal enough for Williams to pull himself free. But by then, the fire had spread throughout the helicopter, and enemy soldiers were close enough that Kevin could hear their voices clearly through the jungle undergrowth. He made a decision that would earn him the Purple Heart and haunt him for the rest of his life. Kevin went back into the burning helicopter. Specialist Johnson was still strapped in, unconscious from a severe head wound, completely helpless as flames crawled toward his position. The heat was unbearable, and Kevin's uniform began to smolder as he fought to reach Johnson's harness release. Shrapnel from an exploding ammunition case tore through Kevin's left shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to his knees inside the burning aircraft. The pain was extraordinary. Hot metal fragments buried deep in muscle and bone, his lung punctured and filling with blood. But Kevin could hear Johnson moaning, could see him beginning to regain consciousness, and there was no one else who could save him. Fighting through pain that would have stopped most men, Kevin managed to free Johnson and drag him from the wreckage just before the main fuel tank exploded. The blast threw both men clear of the helicopter, but also announced their position to every enemy soldier within miles. Kevin knew they had perhaps 10 minutes before they would be overrun. Working with Williams, who despite his broken leg, had managed to set up a defensive perimeter, Kevin helped establish a landing zone for the rescue helicopter that was already en route. Those 10 minutes felt like hours. Enemy fire came from 3 directions, and Kevin's wounded shoulder made it difficult to aim his rifle effectively. But he had learned something about himself in that burning helicopter. When other people's lives depended on him, pain became irrelevant. He laid down suppressing fire while Williams coordinated their evacuation, and together they kept their position until the rescue birds arrived. All 5 soldiers survived the crash and the rescue. Johnson recovered fully from his head injury and served 2 more tours. Martinez was medically evacuated but returned to duty 6 months later. Williams kept his leg despite the severe fractures and went on to serve as a drill sergeant, training the next generation of soldiers with stories about courage under fire. Kevin spent 3 weeks in a military hospital in Japan, having shrapnel removed from his shoulder and lung. The doctors said he was lucky. A few more minutes in that burning helicopter, and he would have died from smoke inhalation. The Purple Heart ceremony was small and private, attended only by his squad members and commanding officers who had read the after-action reports. This medal, the colonel said, as he pinned the Purple Heart to Kevin's hospital gown, represents more than just being wounded in combat. It represents sacrifice for your fellow soldiers, courage under fire, and the willingness to put others before yourself. Sergeant Ramsey, you have earned the respect and gratitude of your country. At 22 years old, Kevin thought he understood what those words meant. He thought the hardest part was over, that coming home would be the reward for his service. He had no way of knowing that the real battle was just beginning. The Vietnam War ended officially in 1975, but for Kevin and millions of other veterans, the war never really ended. He came home to a country that wasn't sure how to treat its returning soldiers. There were no parades, no hero's welcome, just a plane ticket to Detroit and advice to put the war behind him and move on with his life. Kevin tried to do exactly that. He used his GI Bill to study mechanical engineering at Wayne State University, earned his degree with honors, and found work with Ford Motor Company, designing manufacturing systems. For 5 years, it seemed like he had successfully transitioned to civilian life. He married his college sweetheart, bought a small house in a working-class neighborhood, and started planning for children. But the war had left invisible wounds that Kevin didn't understand and couldn't explain. The nightmares came sporadically at first. Once or twice a month, he would wake up screaming, back in that burning helicopter or under enemy fire. His wife was patient and supportive, but as the years passed, the nightmares became more frequent and more intense. Sleep became an enemy. Kevin would lie awake for hours, afraid to close his eyes, afraid of what his dreams would show him. He started drinking to help himself sleep, just a beer or 2 before bed. Then it became a 6-pack. Then it became whatever it took to quiet the voices in his head long enough to get a few hours of rest. The worst part wasn't the nightmares or even the drinking. The worst part was the guilt. Kevin couldn't understand why he had survived when so many others hadn't. He couldn't reconcile the hero narrative that others imposed on him with the reality of his memories. Yes, he had saved his squad members, but he also remembered the enemy soldiers he had killed, the villages that had been destroyed, the civilians caught in crossfire. Post-traumatic stress disorder wasn't a recognized diagnosis in the early 1980s. Veterans were expected to tough it out, to compartmentalize their experiences and function normally in civilian society. There were no support groups, no counseling programs, no understanding that the human mind wasn't designed to process the kind of trauma that Kevin and his generation had experienced. Kevin's marriage ended in 19... His wife had tried to help, but she couldn't compete with the ghosts that haunted their bedroom every night. The divorce was amicable. She still loved him, but she couldn't watch him destroy himself anymore. Kevin didn't fight for custody of their young daughter. He knew he wasn't fit to be a father in his current condition. Work became impossible As the drinking got worse, Kevin would show up hungover, miss meetings, fall asleep at his desk. Ford gave him chances, more than he deserved, probably. But eventually they had to let him go. Kevin's supervisor, a Korean War veteran, pulled him aside on his last day and slipped him the phone number for a VA counselor. "I don't know what you saw over there, son," the older man said, "but I know it's eating you alive. There are people who can help, but you have to want help." Kevin kept that phone number in his wallet for 3 years before he finally called it. By then, he had lost his house, his car, and most of his dignity. He was living in a series of boarding houses and cheap motels, working day labor when he could function well enough to show up. The VA counselor was a Vietnam veteran himself, and for the first time since coming home, Kevin felt like someone understood what he was carrying. Recovery was slow and incomplete. Kevin got sober in 1989 and stayed that way, but sobriety didn't cure the PTSD or erase the guilt. He found steady work as a maintenance supervisor at a community college, earned enough to rent a small apartment, and rebuilt some semblance of a normal life. But he was always one setback away from homelessness, always fighting battles that other people couldn't see. The bureaucratic nightmare that destroyed Kevin's later life began with a fire at the VA regional office in 1985. The electrical malfunction gutted 2 floors of the building, destroying thousands of veterans' records, including Kevin's complete service file. When he applied for disability benefits in 1992, the VA claimed they had no record of his military service beyond basic enlistment information. Kevin had kept some of his medals and certificates, but not everything. He had given his Bronze Stars to his ex-wife during the divorce, thinking his daughter might want them someday. His Purple Heart was safely stored in a bank safety deposit box, but the accompanying citation and medical records had been lost when he was evicted from his apartment in 19. Proving his service and his right to benefits became a full-time job that Kevin couldn't afford to pursue while working to keep a roof over his head. The VA bureaucracy was designed for people who had time, patience, and the mental clarity to navigate complex paperwork systems. Kevin had none of those things, and his pride prevented him from asking for help. When the community college downsized in 2003, Kevin found himself 62 years old and unemployed in a job market that had no use for aging veterans with limited computer skills. His small savings lasted 6 months. His health insurance lasted 3 months. His apartment lease lasted until the end of that year. Kevin became homeless, not through any moral failing or character defect, but through the simple reality that minimum wage jobs don't pay enough for housing in most American cities, and that our society provides very little safety net for people who fall through the cracks. At 63, he was too young for Medicare, but too old for most employers to take a chance on him. The streets were brutal for a man Kevin's age. Shelters were overcrowded and often dangerous. Kevin learned to sleep in doorways, under bridges, in abandoned buildings when he could find them. He learned which businesses would let him use their restrooms, which churches served meals on which days, how to stay warm when the temperature dropped below freezing. The Purple Heart became his most treasured possession, not because of its monetary value, but because it was the only proof he had left of a time when his life had meaning and purpose. He carried it in a small zippered pouch in his jacket pocket, along with a faded photograph of his squad members and a letter from Staff Sergeant Williams, thanking him for saving his life. Kevin's first arrest was for trespassing. He had been sleeping in the parking garage of an office building during a winter storm. Officer Aiden Scott was the arresting officer, and Kevin's first impression was of a man who saw homeless people as problems to be solved, rather than human beings deserving of dignity. Scott processed the arrest with bureaucratic efficiency, showing no interest in Kevin's attempts to explain his situation. The second arrest was for loitering outside a VA office, where Kevin had been waiting since dawn to speak with a counselor about his lost benefits paperwork. Again, Officer Scott was the responding officer, and this time he seemed to take personal offense at Kevin's presence. He accused Kevin of working the system and playing the victim card when Kevin mentioned his military service. By the time of the convenience store incident that brought Kevin to court, Officer Scott had developed a personal antipathy toward him that went beyond professional duty. Scott saw Kevin as everything he despised about modern society, someone who refused to take responsibility, who made excuses, who expected handouts based on questionable claims about past service. Kevin had taken the sandwich and water bottle because he hadn't eaten in 2 days and was becoming dangerously dehydrated. He had planned to pay for them when his disability check arrived the following week, but the store manager called the police before Kevin could explain. When Officer Scott arrived and saw who the suspect was, his first words were, well, look who we have here." Sitting in that defendant's chair, listening to Officer Scott mock his service and dismiss his Purple Heart as a pawnshop purchase, Kevin felt something break inside him that had been cracking for years. Not his spirit that had been tested by worse men than Aiden Scott and had survived. What broke was his willingness to let other people define his worth based on his current circumstances, rather than his lifetime of service and sacrifice. Kevin Ramsey had saved 5 lives in a burning helicopter while enemy soldiers closed in on his position. He had earned his medals through blood and courage, not through fraud or theft. He had fallen through the cracks of a system that was supposed to catch him, but he had never stopped being the man who chose to go back into that fire when others needed him. The truth was about to surface, and it would expose more than just Officer Scott's ignorance. It would reveal how a grateful nation treats its heroes when they need help the most. Officer Aiden Scott had never served in the military, and that fact shaped his worldview in ways he didn't fully understand. Growing up in suburban Phoenix, he had been raised on Hollywood movies about war heroes and comic book stories about soldiers who always did the right thing. His father worked in insurance, his mother taught elementary school, and military service was something that happened to other people's children, usually those from families who couldn't afford college. Scott had wanted to be a police officer since middle school, attracted by the authority, the uniform, and the clear division between good guys and bad guys that television shows made look so simple. He studied criminal justice at Arizona State University, graduated with decent grades, and entered the police academy with genuine intentions to serve his community and uphold the law. His first 5 years on the force had been exemplary. Scott was professional, thorough, and earned commendations for his arrest record and community policing efforts. He worked traffic detail, responded to domestic disputes, and handled routine patrol duties with the competence and dedication his supervisors expected. His annual evaluations consistently rated him as a solid officer with potential for advancement. The change began gradually, so subtly that even Scott didn't recognize it at first. It started with the homeless population that seemed to multiply every year in the downtown district where he was assigned. At first, Scott had tried to connect these individuals with social services, had given them information about shelters and assistance programs, but the problems seemed to get worse instead of better, and Scott began to view these efforts as wasted time and energy. The turning point came during his 7th year on the force, when Scott responded to a domestic violence call involving a homeless veteran who had attacked his girlfriend during what witnesses described as a flashback episode. The veteran, Danny Morrison, had served 2 tours in Iraq and suffered from severe PTSD that went largely untreated due to his inability to navigate the VA system while struggling with addiction. When Scott arrived at the scene, Morrison was in the grip of a full psychological break, convinced he was still in combat and that his girlfriend was an enemy combatant. It took 3 officers to subdue him, and during the struggle, Morrison kept shouting about roadside bombs and insurgent attacks. His girlfriend, despite having been injured, pleaded with the officers to be gentle with him, explaining that he was a decorated veteran who just needed help. In the aftermath, Scott learned that Morrison had earned a Silver Star for actions under fire, had saved multiple soldiers' lives, and had been an exemplary service member until his combat experiences broke something inside him that couldn't be easily fixed. But all Scott could see was a man who used his military service as an excuse for violent behavior, who expected special treatment because he wore a uniform years ago. "I don't care what he did over there," Scott told his partner as they completed their paperwork. "When you put civilians at risk, you're not a hero anymore. You're just another criminal who needs to be locked up." That incident established a pattern in Scott's thinking that would grow stronger over the years. He began to view military service claims with automatic skepticism, especially when they came from homeless individuals or people with substance abuse problems. In Scott's mind, real veterans were successful, functional members of society. Anyone who couldn't maintain housing or employment was either lying about their service or using it as a crutch to avoid taking responsibility for their failures. The Riverside Police Department, like many law enforcement agencies, had no specific training program for dealing with veterans or understanding military culture. Officers received basic instruction on recognizing mental health crises and de-escalation techniques, but there was no systematic effort to help officers understand PTSD, traumatic brain injury, or the unique challenges facing veterans transitioning to civilian life. Scott's superiors noticed his effectiveness in clearing homeless camps and dealing with what they termed quality of life issues. He had a talent for moving people along without generating complaints or excessive use of force reports. His arrest numbers were solid, and he seemed to have a handle on the recurring problems that plagued downtown business districts. What they didn't see was the developing pattern of bias that influenced how Scott approached anyone claiming military service. Over time, Scott had encountered dozens of homeless individuals who claimed to be veterans. Some were clearly fabricating their stories, claiming to have served in conflicts that ended before they were born, or displaying obvious ignorance about basic military procedures and terminology. These encounters reinforced Scott's skepticism and made him less likely to take any veteran's claims seriously. What Scott failed to understand was that the majority of homeless veterans were legitimate. According to VA statistics, veterans make up about 11% of the adult homeless population, despite representing only 6% of the general population. Combat veterans are particularly vulnerable due to PTSD, traumatic brain injury, and the difficulty many experience transitioning from the structured military environment to civilian life. But statistics meant nothing to Scott compared to his personal experiences with people like Danny Morrison. Every homeless veteran he encountered seemed to confirm his belief that military service was either exaggerated or irrelevant to their current circumstances. He developed a standard approach: demand immediate proof of service, question inconsistencies in their stories, and treat any mention of combat medals or decorations with automatic suspicion. Scott's colleagues began to notice his particular antipathy toward homeless individuals claiming military service. During roll call briefings, he would share stories about fake veterans he had encountered, often embellishing details to make them seem more obviously fraudulent. Other officers found these stories entertaining, and Scott enjoyed the approval of his peers, who saw him as someone who couldn't be fooled by sob stories and manipulation. The department's unofficial policy toward homeless veterans was shaped more by individual officer attitudes than by any formal training or guidelines. Some officers, particularly those with military backgrounds themselves, tried to connect veterans with appropriate services. Others, following Scott's example, treated veteran status claims with skepticism and processed these individuals through the criminal justice system rather than attempting to address underlying issues. Lieutenant Maria Santos, Scott's immediate supervisor, had tried to discuss his approach during his 10-year performance review. She had noticed an increase in complaints about Scott's treatment of homeless individuals, though none had resulted in formal disciplinary action. The complaints typically described Scott as dismissive, condescending, and unwilling to consider that people's circumstances might be more complicated than they appeared. "Officer Scott," Santos had said during their private meeting, "I want to talk about your community policing approach, particularly with our homeless population. Some of the feedback suggests you might benefit from additional training on mental health issues and veteran services." Scott had bristled at the suggestion. "Lieutenant, I've been doing this job for 10 years. I know how to spot someone trying to work the system. These people make choices, and they need to live with the consequences. Giving them excuses just enables their behavior." Santos had tried a different approach. "What about connecting them with appropriate services? The VA has outreach programs. There are mental health resources available. Maybe we can help solve the underlying problems, instead of just cycling people through the arrest process." "Ma'am, with respect, that's not law enforcement. That's social work. My job is to maintain order and enforce the law, not to rehabilitate people who don't want to be helped." The conversation had ended without resolution, and Santos had made a note in Scott's file about the need for additional training. But budget constraints and staffing issues meant that note was never acted upon, and Scott continued operating according to his own understanding of effective policing. Scott's interaction with Kevin Ramsey had been building for months before the convenience store incident. Their first encounter occurred when Kevin was sleeping in a doorway during a particularly cold winter night. Scott had roused him with his flashlight and demanded identification, treating Kevin's polite explanations about having nowhere else to go as potential lies requiring investigation. When Kevin mentioned his military service and his difficulties with VA benefits, Scott immediately challenged him. What unit? When did you serve? Where were you stationed? The questions came rapid fire, designed to catch inconsistencies or gaps in knowledge that might indicate deception. Kevin answered accurately, but Scott attributed his correct responses to research rather than lived experience. Anyone can look this stuff up online, Scott had told Kevin. If you're really a veteran, where are your papers? Where's your VA card? Real veterans keep track of their documentation. Kevin had tried to explain about the fire at the VA office, the lost records, the bureaucratic maze that had cost him his benefits. But to Scott, these explanations sounded like elaborate excuses. In his experience, people who couldn't produce immediate proof of their claims were usually lying, and Kevin's homeless status made him even less credible. The second encounter had been more adversarial. Kevin was waiting outside the VA office when it opened, hoping to speak with a counselor about his case. Scott received a call about someone loitering and arrived to find Kevin sitting quietly on a public bench, reading a newspaper he had found in a trash can. "We've got to stop meeting like this," Scott had said, his tone making it clear this was not friendly banter. "Business owners are complaining about you hanging around. Time to move along." Kevin had explained that he was waiting for the VA office to open, that he had legitimate business there. Scott had demanded to see Kevin's appointment confirmation, his veteran identification, any documentation that would prove he belonged there. When Kevin couldn't produce the paperwork Scott demanded, he was cited for loitering and ordered to leave the area. "Let me give you some advice," Scott had said as he handed Kevin the citation. "Playing the veteran card doesn't work with me. I've seen every scam in the book, and yours isn't original. Get your life together instead of making excuses about things that may or may not have happened 20 years ago." By the time of the convenience store incident, Scott had convinced himself that Kevin Ramsey was a chronic offender who used fabricated military service to manipulate the system. In Scott's mind, Kevin represented everything wrong with modern society: personal responsibility abandoned in favor of victimhood, legitimate veteran services abused by fraudsters, and bleeding heart social policies that enabled dysfunction instead of demanding accountability. What Scott never bothered to investigate was Kevin's actual military record. A simple database query would have revealed Kevin's service history, his decorations, and his honorable discharge status. But Scott's assumptions made such investigations seem unnecessary. He had already decided what kind of person Kevin was, and evidence that contradicted that decision was dismissed as irrelevant. The pattern extended beyond Kevin to dozens of other homeless veterans Scott had encountered over the years, men and women whose service records included Bronze Stars, Purple Hearts, combat action ribbons, and other decorations earned through genuine sacrifice and courage. Scott had dismissed them all as fraudsters and failures, never considering that his own inexperience with military culture might be limiting his understanding. The Riverside Police Department's Veteran Liaison Program existed on paper but not in practice. The officer designated as Veteran Coordinator had been transferred to another division 2 years earlier and never replaced. Training materials about veteran issues gathered dust in supply closets, while officers like Scott developed their own approaches based on personal bias and limited understanding. Scott's worldview was reinforced by a culture within the department that valued efficiency over understanding, arrest statistics over problem solving, and officer safety over community trust. Veterans who couldn't immediately prove their status were treated as potential threats rather than individuals who might need help navigating complex bureaucratic systems. The irony was that Scott genuinely believed he was protecting legitimate veterans from fraudsters. In his mind, his skepticism served an important purpose: preventing resources from being diverted to people who didn't deserve them. He saw himself as a guardian of veteran integrity, exposing false claims and ensuring that real heroes weren't diminished by association with pretenders. But Scott's definition of real veterans was impossibly narrow. They had to be successful, well-adjusted, and able to produce immediate documentation of their service. Anyone who fell short of this standard was presumed to be lying, regardless of their actual history or circumstances. This approach guaranteed that the veterans most in need of help would be the least likely to receive it. The system that allowed Scott's biases to flourish unchecked was bigger than one officer or one department. It reflected broader societal attitudes about homelessness, mental health, and personal responsibility that made it easy to dismiss complex problems as individual failures. Veterans were supposed to be heroes, and heroes weren't supposed to need help. As Scott testified in Kevin Ramsey's case, he was completely confident in his assessment. Everything about Kevin confirmed Scott's preconceptions. The homeless status, the inability to produce immediate documentation, the claims about lost records and bureaucratic failures. In Scott's experience, these were always lies told by people who couldn't accept responsibility for their choices. What Scott didn't know was that his 15-year career of dismissing veteran claims was about to be exposed in the most public and humiliating way possible. The truth about Kevin Ramsey would reveal not just Scott's individual bias, but the systematic failure of institutions that were supposed to protect and serve those who had already given everything in service to their country. The reckoning was coming, and it would force everyone in that courtroom to confront uncomfortable questions about how society treats its most vulnerable heroes. Defense attorney Mark Torres left the courtroom that Tuesday morning with a knot in his stomach that had nothing to do with the stale coffee he'd grabbed from the vending machine. Something about Kevin Ramsey's case bothered him in ways he couldn't articulate. 23 years old and 6 months out of law school, Torres was still idealistic enough to believe that everyone deserved competent representation, even if they couldn't pay for it. The public defender's office, where Torres worked, was chronically understaffed and overwhelmed. Most cases were resolved through plea bargains, negotiated in courthouse hallways, with attorneys who had barely 5 minutes to review their clients' files. Torres typically handled 40 to 50 cases at any given time, making thorough investigation a luxury he couldn't afford. But Kevin Ramsey's dignity in the face of Officer Scott's humiliation had affected him more than he wanted to admit. Back in his cramped office, Torres pulled Kevin's file from the stack on his desk. The facts seemed straightforward. 68-year-old homeless man steals sandwich and water bottle, value under $20. Third-degree misdemeanor with maximum penalty of 60 days in jail. Kevin had no significant criminal history beyond the vagrancy and loitering arrests. Scott had mentioned, under normal circumstances, Torres would recommend a guilty plea in exchange for time served and community service. But Officer Scott's testimony had raised questions that Torres couldn't ignore. The contempt in Scott's voice when he dismissed Kevin's military service, the automatic assumption that the Purple Heart was fraudulent, the complete lack of interest in verifying Kevin's claims, it all suggested a level of bias that might be worth challenging. Torres reached for his phone and dialed the number Sarah Ramsey had given him. Kevin's niece had tried to speak during the hearing, claiming her uncle was a legitimate veteran with documentation. If she was telling the truth, Scott's testimony might constitute perjury, or at least reckless disregard for the facts. Sarah answered on the second ring. "Mr. Torres? Thank you for calling. I've been so worried about Uncle Kevin. What that officer said in court today, it was horrible. My uncle earned that Purple Heart. He saved people's lives." "Ms. Ramsey," Torres said carefully, "I need to ask you some specific questions about your uncle's military service." Officer Scott made very serious allegations about stolen valor. "If those allegations are false, we need to prove it with documentation." "I have documentation," Sarah said immediately. "Not everything. A lot of his papers were lost over the years when he was homeless. But I have copies of some things. His discharge papers, a citation for one of his Bronze Stars, some photographs from Vietnam, and I know how to contact other veterans who served with him." Torres felt his pulse quicken. If Sarah was telling the truth, they might have grounds for a motion to dismiss based on prosecutorial misconduct. At minimum, they could expose Scott's bias and potentially get Kevin's charges reduced to a misdemeanor with no jail time. Ms. Ramsey, I need you to bring me everything you have, tonight if possible, and I need names and contact information for any veterans who can verify your uncle's service record. I'll bring everything to your office this evening, Sarah promised. Mr. Torres, you have to understand, my uncle isn't a criminal. He's a war hero who fell through the cracks. The system failed him, and now it's failing him again. After hanging up, Torres called his investigator Jimmy Chen, a former police detective who had left the force after becoming disillusioned with what he saw as systemic bias in law enforcement. Chen worked part-time for the public defender's office, handling cases that required more investigation than overworked attorneys could provide. Jimmy, I need you to run a background check on Officer Aiden Scott. I want to know about complaints, disciplinary actions, patterns of behavior, particularly anything involving homeless individuals or veterans, and I need it fast. We're back in court tomorrow. Chen's experience told him that complaints against police officers were often buried or dismissed, but patterns of behavior sometimes emerged when you knew where to look. What kind of case are we talking about, Mark? Petty theft by a homeless veteran. Scott testified that the guy's Purple Heart is fake, bought at a pawn shop, but the defendant's niece says she has documentation proving otherwise. Scott's got a reputation, Chen said after a moment. Nothing official, but other officers have mentioned he's got a thing about homeless vets, thinks they're all fakers and fraudsters. I'll dig deeper and see what I can find. That evening, Sarah Ramsey arrived at Torres's office, carrying a manila envelope and a small wooden box. She was a middle-aged woman with graying hair and tired eyes, wearing the kind of clothes that suggested she worked in an office but couldn't afford expensive clothing. Her hands shook slightly as she placed the materials on Torres's desk. "This is everything I could save," she said softly. "When Uncle Kevin was drinking heavily, he lost a lot of his military papers. Some were stolen when he was homeless. Others were lost when he got evicted from different places. But these documents are genuine." Torres opened the envelope first. Kevin's DD-214 discharge form was there, showing 3 tours of duty in Vietnam, honorable discharge, and a list of decorations that made Torres's breath catch: Purple Heart, Bronze Star with 2 oak leaf clusters, Distinguished Service Cross, Combat Infantryman Badge, and several unit citations. This wasn't the record of someone who had bought medals at a pawn shop. This was the record of a genuine war hero. "The Distinguished Service Cross?" Torres asked. "That's the second highest military decoration for valor, isn't it?" Sarah nodded. "Uncle Kevin never talks about what he did to earn it. I found out from other veterans who served with him. He saved 5 soldiers from a burning helicopter while under enemy fire, got wounded in the process, which is how he earned the Purple Heart." Torres opened the wooden box to find medals carefully wrapped in tissue paper. The Purple Heart was there, along with the bronze stars and other decorations. Each medal showed signs of age and handling, but there was nothing that suggested they were reproductions or fakes. More importantly, the serial numbers and manufacturer's marks were consistent with medals issued during the Vietnam War era. "Mrs. Ramsey, these documents appear to be authentic. Your uncle's service record is extraordinary. Why didn't he present this information during his previous arrests?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears, pride, mostly, and shame about what his life became after the war. "Uncle Kevin doesn't like to talk about his service because it reminds him of everything he lost afterward. The PTSD, the drinking, the homelessness. He thinks he dishonored his medals by becoming what he became." Torres studied the citation for Kevin's Distinguished Service Cross. The language was formal and understated, as military citations typically were, but the actions it described were remarkable. Kevin had voluntarily returned to a burning helicopter under enemy fire, not once but twice, to rescue wounded soldiers. The citation noted that his actions undoubtedly saved the lives of 5 fellow soldiers and reflected the highest traditions of military service. "I need to contact some of the veterans who served with Uncle Kevin," Sarah continued. "Staff Sergeant Williams, who was Kevin's squad leader. Kevin saved his life in that helicopter crash. Williams lives in Phoenix now, retired from the Army after 25 years. He still keeps in touch with some of the other guys from their unit. Torres was already formulating his strategy. If he could present this evidence in court, it would completely destroy Scott's credibility and potentially expose a pattern of bias that might affect other cases. But he needed to be careful. Attacking a police officer's testimony required solid evidence and careful preparation. "Mrs. Ramsey, I need you to contact Staff Sergeant Williams and anyone else who can verify your uncle's service. I need them to be willing to testify, either in person or by affidavit, and I need it by tomorrow morning." The next few hours passed in a blur of phone calls and document verification. Torres contacted the National Archives to request Kevin's complete military personnel file. He reached out to veteran service organizations to verify the authenticity of Kevin's medals and decorations. Most importantly, he spoke directly with retired Staff Sergeant Robert Williams, who confirmed every detail of Kevin's service and offered to testify on his behalf. "Kevin Ramsey is one of the finest soldiers I ever served with," Williams told Torres over the phone. "What he did in that helicopter crash, I wouldn't be alive today if not for his courage. If some cop is calling him a fraud, that cop doesn't know what the hell he's talking about." Jimmy Chen's investigation into Officer Scott revealed a troubling pattern. While there were no formal complaints on file, Chen's conversations with other officers and social workers painted a picture of an officer who routinely dismissed veteran status claims without investigation. 3 separate homeless shelters reported encounters with Scott where he had accused their clients of stolen valor without any evidence. "Scott's got a blind spot when it comes to homeless veterans," Chen reported. "He automatically assumes they're lying, and he's never bothered to verify his assumptions. I found at least 6 cases in the past 2 years where he arrested people claiming veteran status, and in every case he testified that their claims were probably fraudulent." Torres felt a mixture of excitement and anger. Excitement because he had grounds for a strong defense. Anger because Scott's pattern suggested that other veterans had been wrongly discredited and potentially convicted based on false testimony. The real breakthrough came when Torres contacted the Veterans Administration's Fraud Investigation Unit. He explained the situation and provided Kevin's social security number and service dates. Within 2 hours, he received a call back from investigator Patricia Moss, a retired Marine who specialized in stolen valor cases. "Mr. Torres," Moss said, "I've reviewed Kevin Ramsey's file. This man is absolutely a legitimate veteran with an exceptional service record. His Purple Heart is genuine, earned in action, and properly documented. Anyone claiming otherwise is either ignorant or lying." "What about his VA benefits?" Torres asked. "He's been homeless for years, claiming the VA lost his records." "Unfortunately, that's true too. His file was among those destroyed in the 1985 fire at our regional office. He's been trying to reconstruct his benefits claim for years, but the process is complicated and he didn't have adequate assistance. We've actually been looking for him to notify him that his benefits have been approved." Torres couldn't believe what he was hearing. Kevin Ramsey wasn't just a legitimate veteran. He was a legitimate veteran whose benefits had been approved while he was homeless and unaware. The system hadn't just failed him. It had actively worked against him while he lived on the streets. "Ms. Moss, would you be willing to testify about Mr. Ramsey's service record and the circumstances of his lost benefits?" "Absolutely. And Mr. Torres, you should know that questioning the legitimacy of a properly documented Purple Heart recipient is taken very seriously by the veteran community. If this officer made those statements under oath without any investigation, he could be facing federal charges for interfering with veteran benefits." That evening, Torres worked until midnight, preparing his motion to dismiss charges and his cross-examination strategy for Officer Scott. The evidence was overwhelming. Kevin Ramsey was not only a legitimate veteran, but a decorated war hero whose homelessness resulted from systemic failures rather than personal inadequacy. The irony was stark. Officer Scott had spent 15 years assuming that homeless veterans were fraudsters, when the reality was that legitimate veterans were falling through bureaucratic cracks, while their service was questioned by people who had never worn a uniform. Scott's bias hadn't protected veteran integrity. It had victimized the very people it was supposed to serve. Torres's phone rang just before midnight. It was Sarah Ramsey, calling with news that would change everything. "Mr. Torres, I just got off the phone with 3 more veterans from Uncle Kevin's unit. They're flying in tomorrow morning to testify. But there's something else. One of them recorded the local news coverage of the trial. Officer Scott's testimony is already spreading on social media. Veterans groups are furious that someone would call Kevin's Purple Heart fake without any evidence. Torres realized that Kevin's case was about to become much bigger than a simple petty theft trial. The veteran community was rallying around one of their own, and Officer Scott's credibility was about to be destroyed in the most public way possible. Mrs. Ramsey, tell your uncle that help is coming. Real help from people who understand what his service means. Officer Scott made a serious mistake when he attacked your uncle's honor without bothering to learn the truth. As Torres finally left his office that night, he felt something he hadn't experienced since law school. The conviction that he was about to fight for genuine justice. Kevin Ramsey's trial was going to expose more than just one officer's bias. It was going to force the entire system to confront how it treated its most vulnerable heroes. The evidence was clear, the witnesses were ready, and the truth was about to surface in ways that would change everything for both Kevin Ramsey and Officer Aiden Scott. The real trial was about to begin. The second day of Kevin Ramsey's trial began with an atmosphere that no one in the courtroom could have anticipated. Word had spread through social media overnight about Officer Scott's testimony, dismissing a homeless man's Purple Heart as a pawn shop purchase. Veterans organizations had picked up the story, and by 8 a.m., a small crowd of protesters had gathered outside the courthouse, carrying signs reading "Honor our heroes" and "Investigate before you humiliate." Judge Catherine Martinez noticed the unusual activity as she arrived at work. Her bailiff informed her that several news outlets were requesting permission to cover what had been scheduled as a routine misdemeanor hearing. Something about yesterday's proceedings had struck a nerve in the community, and Martinez suspected she knew what it was. Officer Aiden Scott arrived at the courthouse confident that today would bring a quick resolution. He had testified to the facts as he understood them, and he expected Kevin Ramsey to accept a plea bargain rather than face the embarrassment of having his fraudulent military claims exposed further. Scott was unaware of the social media storm brewing around his testimony, and he certainly didn't know about the evidence that defense attorney Torres had gathered overnight. Kevin Ramsey sat in the defendant's chair, wearing the same brown suit jacket, but something about his posture had changed. Where yesterday he had seemed resigned to his fate, today he sat with the bearing of a man who knew the truth was about to surface. His niece Sarah sat in the front row of the gallery. No longer alone, 3 elderly men in suits had joined her, their military bearing unmistakable even in civilian clothes. Defense attorney Mark Torres had barely slept, but he felt more prepared for a trial than he ever had in his brief career. The manila folder on his table contained documentation that would not only exonerate his client, but expose a pattern of institutional bias that had wronged countless veterans. The wooden box containing Kevin's medals sat beside the folder, its contents about to vindicate a man whose honor had been questioned by someone who had never earned the right to judge it. As court reconvened, the gallery was fuller than it had been the previous day. Word had spread through the veteran community, and several local VFW and American Legion members had come to witness what they hoped would be justice for one of their own. The energy in the room was different, expectant, almost electric with anticipation. Judge Martinez called the court to order and looked directly at Torres. "Mr. Torres, I understand you wish to present additional evidence before we proceed with sentencing?" Torres stood, feeling the weight of responsibility for not just Kevin's case, but for every veteran who had been dismissed and discredited by officials who never bothered to verify their assumptions. "Yes, Your Honor. The defense moves to present evidence that will demonstrate that Officer Scott's testimony yesterday was not only inaccurate, but represents a pattern of bias that has affected the administration of justice." The prosecutor, Jennifer Walsh, looked confused. She had expected a simple plea negotiation, not a challenge to police testimony. "Your Honor, the defendant was caught on camera committing theft. His military status, real or fabricated, doesn't change the underlying crime." "Your Honor," Torres responded, "when a police officer testifies under oath that a Purple Heart recipient's medal is a pawn shop purchase, without any investigation or evidence, It goes to the credibility of all his testimony. The state's case relies entirely on Officer Scott's account of events and his assessment of my client's character. Judge Martinez considered the motion. Martinez had been troubled by Scott's casual dismissal of Kevin's service, particularly given her own family's military background. I'll allow the defense to present its evidence. Officer Scott, please retake the witness stand. Scott walked to the witness stand with the same confidence he had displayed the day before. In his mind, Torres was grandstanding, trying to create doubt about a clear-cut case. Scott had testified hundreds of times, and he knew how to handle young lawyers who thought they could make names for themselves by attacking police officers. Torres approached the witness stand, carrying the manila folder and the wooden box. Officer Scott, you testified yesterday that my client's Purple Heart was likely purchased at a pawn shop. What investigation did you conduct to reach that conclusion? Scott's answer was automatic. As I stated yesterday, I've been on the force for 15 years. I've developed expertise in recognizing fraudulent claims about military service. The defendant's circumstances were consistent with someone who was using fake military memorabilia to gain sympathy. What circumstances specifically? Torres pressed. His homelessness, his inability to produce documentation, his multiple arrests. Real veterans don't typically find themselves in such situations. Torres opened the manila folder and withdrew Kevin's DD-214 discharge form. Officer Scott, are you familiar with the DD-214 form? It's a military discharge document. Scott answered, his confidence beginning to waver slightly. That's correct. And this is my client's DD-214, obtained from the National Archives yesterday evening. Torres handed the document to the court clerk to be marked as evidence. Would you please read the section listing Mr. Ramsey's decorations and awards? Scott took the document, and the color began to drain from his face as he read the extensive list of medals and citations. Purple Heart, Bronze Star, with 2 oak leaf clusters, Distinguished Service Cross, Combat Infantryman Badge, Vietnamese Service Medal with 4 campaign stars. This wasn't the record of someone who had bought medals at a pawn shop. This was the record of a genuine war hero. Officer Scott, Torres prompted, would you please read the decorations aloud for the court? Scott's voice was barely audible as he read the list. Each medal represented genuine service and sacrifice, and the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest military decoration for valor, made it clear that Kevin Ramsey was exactly what he claimed to be. Judge Martinez leaned forward. Officer Scott, did you make any attempt to verify Mr. Ramsey's military service before testifying that his medals were fraudulent? No, Your Honor, Scott admitted, his voice cracking slightly. I based my testimony on my experience with similar cases. Torres opened the wooden box and carefully removed Kevin's Purple Heart. The medal caught the courtroom lights. Its purple ribbon faded, but the bronze heart itself, unmistakably genuine. Officer Scott, this is the Purple Heart that you testified was purchased at a pawn shop. Would you like to examine it? Scott looked at the medal and then at Kevin, who met his gaze with quiet dignity. The homeless man Scott had dismissed as a fraud was looking at him with the patience of someone who had survived real battles and understood that truth eventually surfaces. Officer Scott, Torres continued, I'd like to read you the citation for Mr. Ramsey's Distinguished Service Cross. He withdrew a document from the folder and began to read aloud. For extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations involving conflict with an armed hostile force, Sergeant Kevin Ramsey distinguished himself by exceptionally valorous actions on 15 April 1987 while serving with Company B, 1st Battalion 8th Infantry Regiment. When his helicopter was shot down in hostile territory, Sergeant Ramsey, despite being wounded by shrapnel, voluntarily returned to the burning aircraft twice to rescue trapped soldiers. His selfless actions under enemy fire resulted in the successful evacuation of 5 wounded soldiers who would otherwise have perished. Sergeant Ramsey's extraordinary heroism and devotion to duty were in keeping with the highest traditions of military service and reflect great credit upon himself, his unit, and the United States Army. The courtroom was silent, except for the sound of someone in the gallery quietly crying. Officer Scott stared at the citation, realizing that the man he had dismissed as a fraud had performed acts of heroism that Scott couldn't even imagine. Torres wasn't finished. Officer Scott, the citation mentions that Mr. Ramsey was wounded while rescuing his fellow soldiers. That's how he earned the Purple Heart. That you testified was fake. Would you like to revise your testimony? Before Scott could answer, Torres addressed the court. Your Honor, I have 3 veterans present who served with Mr. Ramsey and witnessed the actions described in this citation. I'd like to call Staff Sergeant Robert Williams to testify. The elderly man who had been sitting in the gallery stood and walked to the witness stand with the measured pace of someone who had spent decades in military service. At 71, Williams still carried himself like a soldier, and his presence commanded immediate respect from everyone in the courtroom. After being sworn in, Williams looked directly at Kevin with obvious affection and respect. Your Honor, Kevin Ramsey saved my life on April 15, 19. I was trapped in that burning helicopter with a broken leg, and Kevin came back for me, even though he was wounded and the aircraft was about to explode. I owe him everything. Williams turned to look at Officer Scott, his expression showing the disgust that comes from watching someone dishonor a genuine hero. That man sitting over there called Kevin's Purple Heart fake. Let me tell you something. I watched Kevin earn that medal. I watched him bleed for it. I watched him risk his life not just for me but for 4 other soldiers who went home to their families because Kevin Ramsey refused to abandon his brothers. The impact of Williams's testimony was immediate and devastating. Officer Scott's credibility wasn't just damaged, it was completely destroyed. His assumptions about Kevin had been not just wrong, but offensively wrong, and his willingness to testify about matters he hadn't investigated revealed a level of professional incompetence that shocked everyone present. Torres called his second witness, retired Colonel James Patterson, who had been Williams's commanding officer during the helicopter incident. Patterson's testimony added official weight to Williams's account, confirming that Kevin's heroism had been properly documented and that his decorations were not only genuine, but hard-earned. Officer Scott's characterization of Mr. Ramsey's service is not just inaccurate, Patterson testified. It's an insult to every soldier who has ever served with honor. Kevin Ramsey is precisely the kind of veteran that our society should be helping, not criminalizing. As the morning progressed, Torres systematically demolished every assumption Scott had made about Kevin. He presented evidence of the 1985 fire that destroyed Kevin's VA records, documentation of his recently approved benefits claim, and testimony from social workers about the challenges facing homeless veterans with PTSD. The most damaging revelation came when Torres called VA investigator Patricia Moss to testify about stolen valor cases. Moss, a former Marine with extensive experience in military fraud investigations, delivered testimony that left Officer Scott's reputation in ruins. In my 15 years investigating stolen valor cases, Moss testified, I have never seen legitimate military decorations dismissed so casually and without investigation. Officer Scott's approach represents exactly the kind of bias that prevents legitimate veterans from receiving the help they need. Moss continued, Mr. Ramsey's service record is extraordinary. His decorations are genuine, properly documented, and earned through actions that most people couldn't imagine. For someone to call his Purple Heart a pawn shop purchase without any investigation is not just wrong, it's offensive to every veteran who has ever served with honor. By lunch recess, the atmosphere in the courtroom had completely shifted. Officer Scott sat slumped in his chair, realizing that his 15-year career of dismissing veteran claims had been exposed as a pattern of ignorant bias. The prosecution was scrambling to distance itself from Scott's testimony, and even the judge seemed personally offended by the casual way Kevin's service had been dismissed. When court reconvened, Torres presented his final piece of evidence, a letter from the Department of Veterans Affairs, informing Kevin that his disability benefits had been approved and that he was entitled to back payments dating to his original application. The letter had been sent to an address where Kevin no longer lived, explaining why he never received notification that his decades-long fight for recognition had finally succeeded. Judge Martinez had heard enough. Officer Scott, your testimony yesterday was not just inaccurate, it was recklessly irresponsible. You dismissed the service of a decorated war hero without any investigation, and your bias has been exposed as a pattern that may have affected other cases." The judge turned to Kevin, her voice filled with the respect that his service deserved. "Mr. Ramsey, on behalf of this court, I apologize for the way your service has been characterized. Your record speaks for itself, and this community owes you a debt of gratitude that can never be fully repaid." The charges against Kevin were dismissed with prejudice, meaning they could never be refiled. But the real victory was bigger than one case. It was the public vindication of a man whose honor had been questioned by someone who had never earned the right to judge it. As Kevin stood to leave the courtroom, Officer Scott approached him. For a moment, it seemed like Scott might apologize, might acknowledge the magnitude of his error. Instead, he looked at Kevin with confusion, as if he couldn't understand how someone so heroic could have ended up homeless and forgotten. Kevin looked back at Scott with the patience he had learned in jungles and hospital beds, in VA waiting rooms and homeless shelters. "Officer Scott," he said quietly, "real heroes don't always look the way you expect them to. Sometimes they look exactly like the people you've been trained to ignore." The courtroom erupted in applause as Kevin walked toward the exit, flanked by his fellow veterans who had traveled across the country to honor his service. Officer Scott remained seated, finally understanding that his 15 years of assumptions had been 15 years of failing the very people he was supposed to serve and protect. The truth had surfaced, and it would change everything, not just for Kevin Ramsey and Aiden Scott, but for every veteran whose honor had been questioned by people who never bothered to learn their stories. Justice had been served, but the reckoning was just beginning. The afternoon session brought something unprecedented to the Riverside County Superior Court, a parade of military witnesses whose combined service record represented over 2 centuries of dedication to their country. What had begun as a simple theft case had transformed into a powerful demonstration of military brotherhood, honor, and the unbreakable bonds forged in combat. Staff Sergeant Robert Williams remained on the witness stand, his weathered hands steady as he continued his testimony about the man who had saved his life 37 years earlier. The courtroom gallery had filled with more veterans, word having spread through American Legion posts, VFW halls, and social media networks that one of their brothers needed support. "Your Honor," Williams said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had led men in combat, "I want to make sure this court understands exactly what Kevin Ramsey did that day in Vietnam. When our helicopter went down, we were in hostile territory with enemy soldiers closing in. The aircraft was on fire, ammunition was cooking off, and any sane person would have gotten as far away as possible." Williams paused, looking directly at Kevin with obvious pride. But Kevin went back. "Not once, but twice. He pulled me out with a broken leg, dragged Specialist Johnson from the wreckage while unconscious, and helped evacuate 3 other wounded soldiers. He did this while wounded himself, with shrapnel in his shoulder and a punctured lung, while enemy fire was getting closer every minute." The former staff sergeant's voice grew stronger as he continued, "I've served with a lot of brave soldiers in my 25 years in the Army. I've seen men do extraordinary things under fire. But what Kevin did that day, going back into a burning helicopter to save his brothers, that's the kind of courage they write about in military history books." Defense Attorney Torres approached the witness stand with a photograph. "Sergeant Williams, I'm showing you what's been marked as Exhibit C. Can you identify this photograph?" Williams took the picture, and his eyes immediately filled with tears. This was taken 3 days after the helicopter crash at the field hospital in Da Nang. "That's our squad. The 5 men Kevin saved. We're all alive in this picture because of him." Torres handed the photograph to the jury, and then to Judge Martinez, who studied it carefully. 5 young soldiers in hospital beds and wheelchairs, bandaged and broken but alive, surrounding Kevin Ramsey, who despite his own injuries was standing and smiling with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had done his duty. "Sergeant Williams," Torres continued, "in your 25 years of military service, how many Purple Heart recipients have you personally known?" "Dozens," Williams replied. "And I can tell you that every single one of them earned that medal through blood, sacrifice, and service to their country. For Officer Scott to suggest that Kevin's Purple Heart came from a pawn shop. That's not just wrong, it's an insult to every wounded warrior who ever wore the uniform. Williams turned to look at Officer Scott, who had remained silent throughout the testimony, his earlier confidence completely shattered. "Officer Scott, you said real veterans don't end up homeless. Let me educate you about something. Some of the finest soldiers I ever served with came home with invisible wounds that took decades to heal. PTSD, survivor's guilt, traumatic brain injury. These things don't make you less of a veteran. They make you a casualty of war who deserves help, not judgment." The impact of Williams's words was visible throughout the courtroom. Several people in the gallery were crying, and even the court reporter had to pause to compose herself. Judge Martinez, whose own son served in the military, was clearly moved by the testimony. Torres called his next witness, retired Master Sergeant David Chen, who had served as Kevin's squad medic during the helicopter incident. Chen, now 69 and walking with a cane due to his own combat injuries, approached the witness stand with the deliberate pace of someone who had seen too much but maintained his dignity through it all. "Master Sergeant Chen," Torres began, "you were present during the helicopter crash that resulted in Mr. Ramsey earning his Purple Heart. Can you describe his actions from a medical perspective?" Chen adjusted his glasses and spoke with the precision of someone accustomed to giving life or death reports. "From a medical standpoint, what Kevin did should have been impossible. He had significant shrapnel wounds in his left shoulder, a punctured lung that was filling with blood, and probable concussion from the crash impact. Any reasonable person in his condition would have been focused on their own survival." Chen paused, collecting his thoughts. But Kevin wasn't reasonable that day. He was extraordinary. Despite his injuries, despite the pain, despite the very real risk of the helicopter exploding while he was inside it, he kept going back for his brothers. "I've seen a lot of heroism in my time, but what Kevin did transcended normal courage. It was superhuman." The medic's testimony continued with clinical detail about Kevin's injuries and the medical treatment he received. The shrapnel damage to his shoulder required 3 surgeries to repair fully. The lung injury kept him hospitalized for 2 weeks and affected his breathing for months afterward. These weren't minor wounds. They were life-threatening injuries that he sustained while saving other people's lives. Torres introduced medical records from the field hospital documenting the extent of Kevin's injuries and the treatment he received. The records painted a picture of a young soldier who had nearly died saving his fellow troops, contradicting every assumption Officer Scott had made about Kevin's character and service. The third witness was perhaps the most powerful, Colonel James Patterson, who had been the commanding officer for Kevin's unit during the helicopter incident. Now 74 and retired after 30 years of military service, Patterson carried himself with the bearing of someone who had dedicated his life to leading others and understood the true meaning of honor. "Colonel Patterson," Torres said, "you were responsible for investigating the helicopter crash and recommending decorations for the soldiers involved. Can you tell the court about your assessment of Sergeant Ramsey's actions?" Patterson's voice carried the authority of decades of command experience. "Mr. Ramsey's actions that day were among the most extraordinary I witnessed in 30 years of military service. When I interviewed the survivors and reviewed the after-action reports, it became clear that Kevin had performed acts of heroism that went far beyond normal expectations of military duty." The colonel paused, choosing his words carefully. "The Distinguished Service Cross is awarded for extraordinary heroism. It's the second highest military decoration our country can bestow, reserved for actions that are truly exceptional. In my 3 decades of service, I recommended only 12 soldiers for this award. Kevin Ramsey earned it through actions that epitomize the very best of military service." Patterson looked directly at Officer Scott, his expression showing the disappointment of a career military officer watching civilian authority disrespect the sacrifice of his soldiers. Officer Scott's characterization of Mr. Ramsey's service isn't just inaccurate. It demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of what military service means and what our veterans have sacrificed for this country. Torres presented the complete investigation file from the helicopter incident, including witness statements, medical reports, and Patterson's official recommendation for Kevin's decorations. The documentation was overwhelming in its detail and consistency, painting a picture of heroism that was thoroughly investigated and properly recognized by military authorities. The fourth witness brought a different perspective to Kevin's story. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a VA psychiatrist who specialized in treating combat veterans with PTSD, had reviewed Kevin's case file and was prepared to explain why decorated veterans sometimes struggled with homelessness and other challenges. Dr. Martinez, Torres said, "You've reviewed Mr. Ramsey's military and medical records. Can you explain to the court why a decorated combat veteran might experience homelessness?" Dr. Martinez spoke with the clinical expertise of someone who had treated hundreds of veterans with similar struggles. Post-traumatic stress disorder affects approximately 20% of combat veterans, but for those who experienced intense trauma like surviving aircraft crashes and witnessing multiple casualties, the rate is much higher. Mr. Ramsey's case is unfortunately typical of many Vietnam veterans who received inadequate mental health support upon returning home. She continued with an explanation that challenged every stereotype about homeless veterans. Combat veterans with PTSD often experience what we call survivor's guilt, intense psychological distress about surviving when others didn't. This can lead to self-destructive behaviors, substance abuse, and difficulty maintaining employment or housing. These symptoms don't reflect moral weakness or lack of character. They reflect the psychological cost of military service. Dr. Martinez's testimony explained how Kevin's PTSD had contributed to his drinking, his difficulty maintaining employment, and eventually his homelessness. She described the inadequate mental health resources available to Vietnam veterans in the 1970s and the bureaucratic obstacles that prevented many veterans from accessing the help they needed. Officer Scott suggested that real veterans don't become homeless. Dr. Martinez said, "The reality is that veterans are overrepresented in the homeless population precisely because of service-connected disabilities like PTSD and traumatic brain injury. Mr. Ramsey's homelessness doesn't diminish his service. It highlights our society's failure to care for those who sacrificed for our freedom." The fifth witness was unexpected but powerful. Maria Santos, a local VA social worker, who had been trying to locate Kevin for months to inform him about his approved benefits claim. Santos had worked with hundreds of homeless veterans and understood the bureaucratic maze that often prevented them from receiving help. "Mr. Ramsey has been eligible for substantial disability benefits for years," Santos testified. "His case was delayed by the 1985 fire that destroyed his records, but we finally processed his claim based on surviving documentation. We've been trying to find him to arrange back payment of benefits dating to his original application." Santos explained that Kevin was entitled to over $180,000 in back benefits, plus monthly payments of approximately $3,200 for his service-connected disabilities. The money had been sitting in a VA account while Kevin lived on the streets, unable to access help because he couldn't navigate the bureaucratic system alone. "This case illustrates exactly why we need better outreach to homeless veterans," Santos said. "Mr. Ramsey spent years on the streets while the government owed him substantial compensation for his service-connected injuries. The system failed him completely." The final witness was perhaps the most emotionally powerful, Specialist Tommy Rodriguez, now 68, who had been one of the soldiers Kevin rescued from the burning helicopter. Rodriguez had flown in from Texas specifically to testify on Kevin's behalf, and his presence represented the voice of every soldier whose life Kevin had saved. "Mr. Ramsey," Rodriguez said, looking directly at Kevin with tears in his eyes, "I never got to thank you properly for saving my life. I was unconscious when you pulled me from that helicopter, and by the time I woke up in the hospital, you had been transferred to another facility. I've thought about you every day for 37 years. Rodriguez's voice broke as he continued, "I went home from Vietnam, got married, raised 3 children, and had a career as a teacher. All of that happened because Kevin Ramsey risked his life to save mine. My children got to have a father, my wife got to have a husband, and my students got to have a teacher, all because of this man's courage." He turned to face Officer Scott, his voice growing stronger. "For you to call his Purple Heart fake. That medal represents the blood he shed, saving my life and the lives of 4 other soldiers. You don't have the right to question what you've never earned, and you don't have the knowledge to judge what you've never experienced." The cumulative impact of the testimony was overwhelming. 6 witnesses had painted a picture of Kevin Ramsey that completely contradicted Officer Scott's assumptions. Instead of a fraud seeking sympathy, Kevin emerged as a genuine war hero whose homelessness resulted from service-connected disabilities and bureaucratic failures rather than personal inadequacy. Judge Martinez called a brief recess, during which the gallery erupted in conversation. Veterans were embracing Kevin, thanking him for his service, and expressing outrage at how he had been treated. Officer Scott sat alone at the prosecution table, realizing that his 15-year career of dismissing veteran claims had been exposed as a pattern of ignorant bias. When court reconvened, Torres addressed the judge with a motion that surprised everyone. "Your Honor, based on the testimony we've heard today, the defense moves not only for dismissal of charges against Mr. Ramsey, but for a formal investigation into Officer Scott's pattern of bias against veterans and the potential impact on other cases." The motion was supported by a petition signed by over 200 local veterans, demanding accountability for Scott's actions and systemic changes to prevent similar bias in the future. The veteran community had rallied around Kevin, not just to support him, but to ensure that no other veteran would face similar treatment. Judge Martinez granted the motion for dismissal and ordered the police department to conduct a review of all cases where Officer Scott had testified about veteran status. "This court will not tolerate bias against those who have served our country," she said. "Mr. Ramsey's treatment represents a failure of the system that must be addressed comprehensively." As the proceedings concluded, Kevin stood surrounded by his brothers in arms, men who had traveled across the country to honor his service and defend his honor. Officer Scott's credibility lay in ruins, but more importantly, the truth about Kevin Ramsey had finally emerged. The witnesses had done more than vindicate one veteran. They had exposed a pattern of institutional bias and demanded changes that would benefit countless others. The brotherhood forged in combat had proved stronger than prejudice, and justice had been served, not just for Kevin, but for every veteran whose service had been questioned by those who never understood its true cost. The real victory was bigger than one courtroom. It was the beginning of systemic change that would ensure America's heroes received the respect and support they had earned through their sacrifice. The media storm hit Officer Aiden Scott like a hurricane at dawn. By 6 a.m., the morning after Kevin Ramsey's trial, news vans lined the street outside the Riverside Police Department, and reporters were already broadcasting live updates about the decorated war hero, whose Purple Heart had been dismissed as a pawnshop purchased by a police officer who had never bothered to verify his assumptions. The story had gone viral overnight. Video clips of Staff Sergeant Williams's emotional testimony played on every major news network, while social media platforms exploded with outrage from veterans across the country. "Honor Our Heroes" and "Justice for Kevin" were trending nationally, and the full transcript of Scott's dismissive testimony was being shared thousands of times per hour. Police Chief Michael Rodriguez arrived at headquarters to find protesters already gathering. Not angry rioters, but dignified veterans holding signs demanding accountability and reform. These weren't people who could be easily dismissed or ignored. They were decorated combat veterans, retired military officers, and Gold Star families whose sacrifices commanded respect from any reasonable person. Scott himself had spent the night staring at his ceiling, replaying every moment of his testimony and realizing the magnitude of his error. 15 years of assumptions about homeless veterans had been exposed as ignorant bias, and his credibility as a police officer was destroyed. Worse, he was beginning to understand that his prejudices might have affected dozens of other cases involving legitimate veterans. The first call Chief Rodriguez received that morning was from the mayor, who had been fielding angry phone calls from veterans organizations since midnight. The second call was from the district attorney's office, requesting a list of all cases where Scott had testified about veteran status. The third call was from the Department of Veterans Affairs, announcing a federal investigation into potential civil rights violations. "Chief Rodriguez," said VA investigator Patricia Moss over the phone, "we need to review every case where Officer Scott dismissed veteran claims without investigation. If there's a pattern of bias that denied veterans their rights or subjected them to wrongful prosecution, this becomes a federal matter." Rodriguez felt his stomach drop. A federal investigation would mean national attention, potential lawsuits, and scrutiny of the entire department's policies regarding veterans. Scott's bias hadn't just embarrassed the department, it had potentially created legal liability that could cost taxpayers millions. Internal Affairs. Captain Lisa Chen was already pulling Scott's personnel file when Rodriguez arrived at her office. Chen had been a military police officer before joining civilian law enforcement, and she was personally offended by Scott's treatment of Kevin Ramsey. "Chief, we have a problem," Chen said, spreading Scott's case files across her desk. "I've identified at least 23 cases over the past 5 years where Scott arrested homeless individuals claiming veteran status. In every single case, he testified that their claims were probably fraudulent, and in every case, he made no attempt to verify their service records." Rodriguez examined the files, each one representing a potential wrongful conviction or civil rights violation. How many of these people were actually veterans? "I've already started checking," Chen replied. "Of the first 10 cases I verified, 8 were legitimate veterans with honorable discharges. 3 of them were Purple Heart recipients. Scott's bias wasn't just ignorant, it was systematically destroying the lives of people who served our country with honor." The implications were staggering. If Scott had been routinely testifying falsely about veteran status, dozens of legitimate veterans might have been wrongfully convicted, sentenced to jail time, or denied benefits based on his prejudiced testimony. The department faced potential lawsuits, federal intervention, and a complete loss of community trust. Meanwhile, at the local VA office, social worker Maria Santos was fielding calls from veterans who had been affected by Scott's bias. Word had spread through the veteran community that Scott's pattern of dismissing veteran claims was being investigated, and legitimate veterans were coming forward with stories of mistreatment. "Mr. Williams," Santos said to a caller who identified himself as a Vietnam veteran, "you said Officer Scott arrested you for trespassing while you were waiting to apply for benefits?" "That's right," replied James Williams, a 67-year-old Bronze Star recipient. "I was sitting on a bench outside the VA office, waiting for it to open, and Scott told me to move along. When I showed him my discharge papers, he said they looked fake and arrested me for loitering. The charges were eventually dropped, but I never tried to apply for benefits again." Santos made careful notes of Williams's account, adding it to a growing file of similar incidents. Each story followed the same pattern. Scott automatically assumed veteran claims were fraudulent, dismissed documentation without examination, and treated legitimate veterans as criminals rather than heroes deserving of support. The afternoon brought more devastating revelations. Defense attorney Mark Torres had spent the morning reviewing court transcripts from Scott's previous cases, and what he found was a pattern of bias so systematic it appeared intentional. "Judge Martinez," Torres said during an emergency hearing, "Officer Scott's testimony about Mr. Ramsey wasn't an isolated incident. I've identified 41 cases where he made similar claims about fraudulent veteran status, often using identical language about pawn shop medals and fake heroes." Judge Martinez was visibly angry as she reviewed the evidence Torres presented. "Mr. Torres, are you suggesting that Officer Scott has been providing false testimony about veteran status on a systematic basis?" "Your Honor, I'm presenting evidence that suggests exactly that. Officer Scott appears to have developed a standard approach to veteran-related cases that involved automatic assumptions of fraud, regardless of the evidence or lack thereof." The judge ordered an immediate review of all cases where Scott had testified about veteran status, with the possibility of overturning convictions if his bias had affected the outcomes. The order would eventually lead to the release of dozens of wrongfully convicted veterans and millions of dollars in compensation for those who had been harmed by Scott's prejudiced testimony. By evening, the story had reached national news. CNN, Fox News, and MSNBC all featured segments about the decorated war hero, whose Purple Heart had been dismissed by a police officer who had never served. The coverage was universally critical of Scott and supportive of Kevin, but the damage to law enforcement credibility extended far beyond one officer or one department. Veteran service organizations across the country issued statements condemning Scott's actions and demanding systemic reforms. The American Legion, veterans of foreign wars, and disabled American veterans all called for mandatory training for law enforcement officers on veteran issues and federal legislation to protect veterans from discriminatory treatment. The political implications were immediate. Senator Patricia Hayes, a member of the Veterans Affairs Committee, announced hearings on law enforcement bias against veterans. What happened to Kevin Ramsey represents a betrayal of our most fundamental obligation to those who served, she said in a statement. We cannot allow decorated war heroes to be treated as criminals by officers who lack the knowledge or respect to understand their sacrifice. Scott's police union initially tried to defend him, arguing that he had acted according to his training and experience. But as more evidence of his bias emerged, union leaders quietly distanced themselves from his case. No one wanted to be associated with defending an officer who had systematically mistreated Purple Heart recipients and other decorated veterans. The department's attempt at damage control only made things worse. Chief Rodriguez held a press conference announcing Scott's suspension pending investigation, but reporters' questions revealed the depth of the institutional failure. Chief Rodriguez asked Channel 7's investigative reporter, "Your department had no training program for officers dealing with veteran issues. Doesn't that represent a systematic failure to serve a vulnerable population?" Rodriguez's response was defensive and inadequate. "Officer Scott's actions don't reflect the values of this department. We'll be implementing new training protocols to ensure this doesn't happen again." "But Chief," pressed another reporter, "Officer Scott has been making similar claims about fraudulent veteran status for 15 years. How did his supervisors not notice this pattern?" The question exposed the uncomfortable truth. Scott's bias had been overlooked or ignored because homeless veterans were seen as low-priority problems. No one in the department's hierarchy had cared enough about this population to question Scott's assumptions or verify his claims. The most damaging revelation came from retired Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Morrison, who had tried to file a complaint about Scott's treatment of veterans 2 years earlier. Morrison had been volunteering with a homeless veterans program when she witnessed Scott's dismissive treatment of several legitimate veterans. "I submitted a formal complaint to the department about Officer Scott's bias," Morrison told reporters. "I provided specific examples of veterans he had mistreated and offered to help train officers on veteran issues. My complaint was buried. My offer of training was ignored, and Scott continued his pattern of bias without any consequences." Morrison's complaint, which had been filed away and forgotten, provided documented evidence that the department knew about Scott's bias and chose to ignore it. The revelation opened the department to charges of deliberate indifference and willful blindness to civil rights violations. Private investigator Jimmy Chen, working on behalf of wrongfully convicted veterans, discovered the most damaging evidence of all: internal emails, showing that some officers had joked about Scott's hostility toward homeless veterans. The emails contained callous references to Scott's war on fake vets and approving comments about his aggressive approach to homeless individuals claiming military service. The emails revealed a culture of indifference to veteran suffering that extended beyond Scott to other officers and supervisors. What had been portrayed as one officer's bias was exposed as institutional tolerance for systematic mistreatment of vulnerable heroes. As the week progressed, the consequences for Scott became more severe. The district attorney announced that his office was reviewing all cases where Scott had provided testimony, with the possibility of overturning convictions if bias had affected the outcomes. The state attorney general opened a civil rights investigation into the department's treatment of veterans. The FBI began examining whether Scott's actions constituted federal civil rights violations. Scott's personal life crumbled along with his professional reputation. His wife filed for divorce, citing the public humiliation and her inability to defend his actions. His children faced harassment at school from classmates whose families had military connections. His mortgage company began foreclosure proceedings, anticipating his loss of employment and income. The veteran community's response was swift and decisive. Local VFW and American Legion posts organized boycotts of businesses that supported Scott or the police union's defense of his actions. Veteran-owned businesses refused to serve officers from Scott's department. Military families moved their children to different schools to avoid association with Scott's family. But the most devastating consequence for Scott was psychological. Raised on heroic narratives about soldiers and veterans, he had to confront the reality that he had spent 15 years victimizing the very people he claimed to respect. The cognitive dissonance between his stated values and his actual actions created a crisis of identity that therapy would take years to resolve. The department's response evolved from denial to damage control to genuine reform. Chief Rodriguez, facing calls for his own resignation, announced comprehensive changes to department policies and training. New protocols required officers to verify veteran status through official databases before making any claims about fraudulent service. Mandatory training on veteran issues became required for all officers, with annual refresher courses to ensure compliance. The changes came too late for the dozens of veterans Scott had wronged, but they represented a genuine commitment to preventing similar abuses in the future. The department partnered with local veteran service organizations to develop training materials and hired a full-time veteran liaison to work with officers on veteran-related cases. Kevin Ramsey, meanwhile, had become a national symbol of veteran resilience and dignity. Speaking requests poured in from veteran organizations, universities, and government agencies wanting to hear his story. Book publishers offered contracts for his memoir, and documentary filmmakers sought rights to his life story. But Kevin handled his newfound fame with the same quiet dignity he had shown throughout his ordeal. He used media appearances to advocate for homeless veterans and to educate the public about the challenges facing combat veterans with PTSD. His message was consistently focused on helping others rather than seeking revenge against those who had wronged him. Officer Scott made a mistake, Kevin told a national television audience. But the real problem isn't one officer's bias. It's a system that allows decorated veterans to fall through the cracks while their service is questioned by people who never wore the uniform. We need to fix the system, not just punish individuals. As the investigation into Scott's bias expanded, it revealed connections to similar problems in police departments across the country. The case became a catalyst for national reform, leading to federal legislation requiring law enforcement training on veteran issues and creating oversight mechanisms to prevent discriminatory treatment of military service members. The reckoning had begun, and it would extend far beyond Officer Aidan Scott, to encompass an entire system's failure to honor those who had sacrificed everything for their country. Justice was being served, but the true measure of success would be whether the changes prevented other veterans from experiencing the humiliation and injustice that Kevin Ramsey had endured with such remarkable dignity. 6 months after the trial that exposed Officer Aidan Scott's systematic bias against veterans, Kevin Ramsey stood in the Rose Garden of the White House, wearing a crisp new suit and the same Purple Heart that Scott had dismissed as a pawnshop purchase. President Harris had invited Kevin to a ceremony honoring homeless veterans, and his story had become a catalyst for the most comprehensive veteran protection legislation in decades. The transformation in Kevin's life had been remarkable, but it reflected changes much larger than one man's vindication. The scandal that began with a convenience store theft had exposed institutional failures throughout American society and sparked reforms that would protect veterans for generations to come. The president nodded, holding Kevin's complete military file, a thick folder documenting heroism that had been ignored for decades while he lived on the streets. Mr. Ramsey, your story has reminded this nation of our obligation to those who served. The legislation we're signing today will ensure that no veteran faces the treatment you experienced. Kevin now lived in a modest apartment near the VA Medical Center, where he received treatment for his PTSD. The back benefits from his approved disability claim had provided financial security he hadn't known since the 1980s, but more importantly, he had found purpose in advocating for other veterans who faced similar challenges. His quiet dignity during the trial had made him a powerful voice for reform, and he used that platform to educate the public about veteran issues. The real victory, Kevin told the president during their private meeting, isn't what happened to me personally. It's the changes that will prevent other veterans from being humiliated and dismissed by people who never bothered to understand their service. The Kevin Ramsey Veterans Protection Act, as it came to be known, required all law enforcement agencies receiving federal funding to implement comprehensive training on veteran issues. Officers would learn to recognize service-connected disabilities, understand the challenges facing homeless veterans, and follow mandatory verification procedures before questioning anyone's military service. The law also created federal oversight mechanisms to investigate discrimination against veterans and provided funding for veteran liaison programs in police departments nationwide. Officer Aidan Scott's career in law enforcement had ended in disgrace. Fired from the Riverside Police Department after the internal investigation confirmed a pattern of bias spanning 15 years, Scott faced federal civil rights charges that could result in prison time. His pension was forfeited, his police certification revoked, and his testimony in dozens of cases had been thrown out by courts across the state. The civil rights lawsuit filed by wrongfully convicted veterans had bankrupted Scott personally. 23 legitimate veterans had been awarded damages totaling $4.2 million for wrongful arrest, false imprisonment, and violation of their civil rights. Scott's house was foreclosed, his family had relocated to another state, and he worked part-time at a hardware store while facing potential federal prosecution. But perhaps the most devastating consequence for Scott was psychological. Forced to confront the reality of his 15-year pattern of victimizing genuine heroes, Scott had suffered a complete breakdown of his self-image and identity. Court-ordered therapy sessions revealed the depth of his cognitive biases and the systematic way he had dehumanized people he was supposed to serve and protect. "I convinced myself I was protecting real veterans from fraudsters," Scott told his therapist during one of their sessions. "But the truth is, I was destroying the lives of decorated war heroes because I was too arrogant and ignorant to learn about their experiences. I caused immeasurable harm to people who deserved honor and support." Scott's therapist, Dr. Jennifer Walsh, specialized in treating people who had committed serious moral injuries. "Aidan, recognizing the harm you caused is the first step toward making amends. But true redemption requires dedicating your life to repairing the damage and ensuring this never happens again. Our department failed Mr. Ramsey and dozens of other veterans," Martinez said during her first press conference. "We're not just changing our policies, we're changing our culture. Every officer will understand that serving veterans isn't just part of our job, it's a sacred obligation to those who served our country." The Riverside Police Department had undergone complete transformation under new leadership. Chief Rodriguez had resigned in disgrace, replaced by Colonel Sarah Martinez, a retired Army officer with extensive experience in veteran affairs. Martinez implemented comprehensive reforms that went far beyond the minimum requirements of federal legislation. The therapy was part of Scott's plea agreement with federal prosecutors. Rather than face trial for civil rights violations, Scott had agreed to plead guilty to lesser charges in exchange for cooperation with ongoing investigations and a commitment to educate other law enforcement officers about veteran bias. His sentence included 5 years of probation, community service at veteran facilities, and mandatory participation in reform efforts. The new Veteran Liaison Program became a model for law enforcement agencies nationwide. Former military personnel were hired as full-time liaisons, working with officers to identify veterans in crisis and connect them with appropriate services rather than processing them through the criminal justice system. The program's success led to federal funding for similar initiatives across the country. "Kevin's case opened my eyes to systematic injustices I never knew existed," Torres explained to a Senate committee examining veteran issues. Decorated war heroes were being criminalized for experiencing homelessness caused by service-connected disabilities. The legal system was failing the very people who had sacrificed the most for our freedom. Defense attorney Mark Torres had leveraged his success in Kevin's case into a practice specializing in veteran rights. His law firm had handled dozens of cases involving discriminatory treatment of veterans, winning millions in damages and forcing policy changes in multiple agencies. Torres had become a national expert on veteran law, frequently testifying before Congress and training other attorneys on military-related legal issues. Torres's advocacy had contributed to broader legal reforms, protecting veteran rights. Courts now required prosecutors to verify military service claims before allowing officers to testify about fraudulent veteran status. Defense attorneys received training on identifying service-connected disabilities and challenging discriminatory treatment. Legal aid programs expanded to provide free representation for veterans facing criminal charges related to homelessness or PTSD symptoms. Kevin's fellow veterans had remained involved in reform efforts long after the trial ended. Staff Sergeant Williams had become a volunteer advocate for homeless veterans, using his own military credentials to open doors and challenge assumptions. Master Sergeant Chen had testified before Congress about the need for comprehensive veteran support systems. Colonel Patterson had joined advisory committees developing new training materials for law enforcement agencies. The media coverage of Kevin's story had also transformed public understanding of veteran homelessness. Major news networks produced documentary specials examining the complex factors that contribute to veteran homelessness, from PTSD and traumatic brain injury to bureaucratic failures and inadequate support systems. The simplistic narratives about personal responsibility and moral failure were replaced by nuanced discussions of service-connected disabilities and systemic failures. The veterans' advocacy had proven remarkably effective. Their military credentials gave them credibility that civilian advocates often lacked, and their personal experiences provided compelling testimony about the challenges facing former service members. Veteran organizations that had previously focused on traditional issues like benefits and healthcare expanded their missions to include criminal justice reform and homelessness prevention. Kevin's dignity during that trial inspired all of us to do more. Williams explained to a veterans conference, "We realized that we had an obligation to speak up for our brothers and sisters who were suffering in silence. Kevin's courage gave us the motivation to demand the changes that should have happened decades ago." The VA had also undergone significant reforms in response to Kevin's case. The bureaucratic maze that had prevented Kevin from accessing his benefits for decades was streamlined and simplified. New outreach programs actively sought homeless veterans and helped them navigate the benefits process. Mobile units brought services directly to encampments and shelters, eliminating barriers that had previously prevented veterans from getting help. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the VA psychiatrist who had testified about veteran PTSD, had been promoted to Director of Homeless Veteran Services for the entire southwestern region. Her programs became models for addressing the complex needs of veterans experiencing homelessness, combining mental health treatment, benefits assistance, and housing support in comprehensive packages designed to address root causes rather than just symptoms. The changes in Kevin's personal life had been equally remarkable. Beyond the financial security provided by his disability benefits, Kevin had found purpose and community through his advocacy work. He spoke regularly at police academies, veteran organizations, and community groups, sharing his story and educating others about the challenges facing homeless veterans. Kevin's case illustrated everything wrong with our approach to homeless veterans. Dr. Martinez explained to a medical conference, "We were expecting traumatized warriors to navigate bureaucratic systems while living on the streets, then blaming them when they couldn't manage impossible challenges. The reforms we've implemented recognize that our obligation to veterans doesn't end when they take off the uniform." Kevin's speaking engagements had evolved from simple storytelling to sophisticated advocacy for policy reform. He testified before legislative committees, advised government agencies on veteran programs, and consulted with law enforcement organizations developing training materials. His quiet dignity and first-hand experience gave him unique credibility in discussions about veteran issues. "I want my grandchildren to understand that their grandfather wasn't just a homeless man who got in trouble with the police," Kevin told his daughter during one of their weekly visits. "I want them to know that I served my country with honor, that I helped save lives, and that the difficult years don't diminish the service that came before them." Kevin's relationship with his daughter, strained for decades by his drinking and homelessness, had been rebuilt through patient effort and mutual understanding. She had attended the White House ceremony, finally able to feel pride in her father's service rather than shame about his circumstances. Their renewed relationship had given Kevin something he valued more than any medal or recognition: the chance to be a grandfather to her children and to pass on stories of service and sacrifice to the next generation. The Kevin Ramsey Foundation, established with proceeds from his book deal and speaking fees, had become a significant force in veteran advocacy. The foundation provided legal assistance to veterans facing discriminatory treatment, funded training programs for law enforcement officers, and supported research on veteran homelessness and PTSD. Kevin insisted that the foundation's work focus on systematic change rather than individual charity, addressing root causes rather than just symptoms. Mr. Ramsey, Judge Martinez said during her farewell address, "Your case reminded me why I became a judge. Justice isn't just about following procedures and enforcing laws. It's about ensuring that every person who enters this courtroom is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve. Your grace under pressure showed us what true honor looks like." 1 year after the trial, Kevin returned to the Riverside County Superior Court for a very different kind of ceremony. Judge Martinez, who had presided over his case, was retiring, and she had requested that Kevin be present for her final day on the bench. The courtroom was packed with veterans, legal professionals, and community members who had been touched by Kevin's story. Mr. Ramsey, the young veteran, said, his voice filled with emotion, "I wanted to thank you for what you did. Because of your courage, I got help instead of handcuffs. Because of your story, people understood that I needed treatment, not jail time." The judge's words were echoed by dozens of speakers who credited Kevin's case with inspiring their own efforts to reform veteran treatment. Police chiefs described new training programs, attorneys discussed changes in legal practice, and social workers outlined improved support systems. Kevin's trial had become a catalyst for changes that extended far beyond one courtroom to affect institutions throughout American society. As the ceremony concluded, Kevin was approached by a young homeless veteran who had been helped by the reforms Kevin's case had inspired. The veteran, struggling with PTSD from service in Afghanistan, had been connected with treatment and housing through the new liaison program, rather than arrested for vagrancy. The exchange embodied everything Kevin's story had come to represent: the obligation of society to care for those who had sacrificed for freedom, the importance of understanding rather than judging, and the power of dignity in the face of injustice. Kevin's trial had exposed systematic failures, but more importantly, it had demonstrated the possibility of redemption and reform. Kevin embraced the young veteran, seeing in him the reflection of his own journey from broken warrior to healed advocate. "Brother," Kevin said, "we look out for each other. That's what we do." As Kevin walked out of the courthouse that day, he passed the memorial wall where the names of local law enforcement officers killed in the line of duty were engraved. For a moment, he paused to reflect on the complexity of his relationship with law enforcement. Officer Scott had wronged him terribly, but other officers had apologized, learned from the experience, and committed to doing better. Justice isn't about revenge, Kevin reflected in his final interview for this story. It's about truth, accountability, and change. Officer Scott destroyed his own life through his bias and ignorance, but the real victory is that other veterans won't face what I faced. The system learned, the policies changed, and the next homeless veteran who encounters police will be treated with dignity rather than contempt. Kevin's story had become more than a tale of individual vindication. It had become a blueprint for social change. His quiet dignity in the face of injustice had inspired millions of Americans to examine their own assumptions about homelessness, military service, and social obligation. His case had proved that one person's courage to speak truth could transform entire institutions and protect countless others from similar harm. The final chapter of Kevin's story was still being written through the lives of veterans who received help instead of harassment, officers who verified claims instead of dismissing them, and a society that had learned to honor service regardless of the circumstances that followed. His Purple Heart, once dismissed as a pawnshop purchase, had become a symbol of authentic heroism that transcended military service to encompass the courage required to demand justice and dignity for all. The transformation was complete, not just of Kevin Ramsey from homeless veteran to national advocate, but of American society's understanding of its obligation to those who had served. The system that had failed Kevin so completely had been rebuilt through his courage, and his legacy would protect veterans for generations to come. His story was complete, but his impact would last forever. The honor had been restored, the truth had been told, and justice had been served. But more than that, Kevin Ramsey had proved that heroes come in many forms. Sometimes they save lives in burning helicopters, and sometimes they save souls by refusing to let dignity be destroyed by ignorance and bias. Have you ever witnessed someone maintaining their dignity in the face of injustice? Have you seen how one person's courage can transform an entire system? Kevin Ramsey's story shows us that real heroism isn't just about acts of valor in combat. It's about maintaining honor and fighting for truth, even when the whole world seems against you. If this story moved you, if it opened your eyes to the challenges facing our nation's veterans, if it inspired you to think differently about homelessness and service, then please share it. Every share helps us reach someone who might be facing similar struggles, someone who needs to know they're not forgotten. Like this video, if you believe our veterans deserve dignity and respect, regardless of their circumstances, subscribe to Color of Justice if you want to see more stories about courage overcoming injustice, about truth prevailing over prejudice, and about ordinary people doing extraordinary things when it matters most. Comment below and tell us about a veteran in your life, or share a time when you witnessed dignity triumph over discrimination. Your stories matter, your voices matter, and together we can ensure that no hero is forgotten or dismissed. Kevin Ramsey's Purple Heart was earned in blood and sacrifice, but his greatest victory was proving that honor can never be taken away by those who lack the wisdom to recognize it. Thank you for joining us for this journey from humiliation to vindication, from systemic failure to meaningful reform. This is Color of Justice, where every story matters and every voice deserves to be heard.